Hello, my name is Eric Couch, and I'm here today with Fred Sweeney to talk about the vision of State Street. I'm a resident, and I care a lot about State Street, and I understand there's many people who've dedicated a ton of effort to try and figure out what we do going forward. And when I saw what Fred had put together, I thought, my goodness, this is worth sharing. So I'd like to invite Fred to introduce himself and talk to us about his project.
Thanks, Eric. I'm Fred Sweeney. I've lived in Santa Barbara for the last 47 years. I grew up in South San Luis Obispo County. I was actually born in San Luis Obispo. Went on to marry my high school sweetheart. We have been married 53 years. And we both went to Cal Poly, where I received my degree in architecture, and prior to that went to Cuesta College. I became a partner of the city's oldest architectural firm when I was 29 years old, and went on to design a lot of things, several buildings here in Santa Barbara, some out at UCSB. And my last major assignment before I retired a few years ago was designing the Santa Barbara Airport Terminal. And I've been taken out of retirement to come back and consider designs for its new addition. But in the interim, I have been volunteering on a lot of things over the years and doing other projects. And I was invited to participate with some folks that are fellow architects and designers to start considering some images for the vision master planning that the city and its large committee have been going through for the last 3.5 years, and decided to try to put on paper everything that I had heard, and essentially trying to be a translator of the ideas that have come from the community, from the committee, from my colleagues, particularly those of us who participated in the 2020 AIA charrette, and then, yes, maybe included a couple of my passionate efforts for what will happen with State Street from this point forward in the late 2020s. And one of the things it starts out with the history of State Street. At one point, it was just a muddy mess for a long period of its life, up until the late 1800s, when it became paved essentially at some point. But prior to that, there was a trolley that went up and down State Street. It started at Stearns Wharf, went up to what is now probably Victoria, and then later in 1912 was actually cabled, electrified, and then provided trolley transportation up to the Santa Barbara Mission, on up to Alameda Padre Serra, to what became the Normal School, which was the original home of the University of California, Santa Barbara, before it moved out to its current home out on the Mesa by the Santa Barbara Airport. So I sat down and tried to put together some of those ideas. These drawings don't represent anything that are in stone. They're just drawings, primarily to hopefully begin the discussion of what that long vision ought to be for State Street. What does the future look like? Santa Barbara has a long history with State Street and various activities. At one time, it was a 4-lane main street, like many other main streets in the United States. And then it was narrowed down, and then in the 1960s, it was brought down to just 2 lanes of traffic, and each side was put in a concrete pattern to enhance the shopping experience along the state. And during that period, the 1950s, 60s, through the 70s, as in most retail spaces within the country, it was very active, vibrant, and held all the major stores. Sears and Roebuck, Montgomery Ward's. We even had our own department store that was a very important part of our retail community. But one of the challenges with State Street is, one is it goes uphill from the beach or from Stearns Wharf, and it's quite long, unlike some other downtowns, not only in our state but elsewhere, that are confined to maybe some square blocks, etc., and certainly not as long as State Street. So that's a part of the challenges, but also a part of the dream that now has to be addressed. What do we want for the future? What's our dream? And putting a good master plan together not only addresses the objectives of retail and housing and practical requirements for transportation, emergency vehicles and deliveries and all those other kinds of things that one sees on a retail street, but also what are our big dreams? What are the things that we want to think about that may take years to implement? Some may, as any master plan, and I've worked on master plans before, some of which will never come to fruition for all kinds of reasons. And generally when you draw these kind of drawings early in the process, as this is, 20 years from now it may look nothing like those drawings. But that's part of the process, and that's the dialogue that the community is going through now via the city-appointed committee of the State Street Advisory Committee and others. So I want to talk you through some of these drawings. So maybe we can go to the first set of slides that show State Street essentially from Gutierrez Street up to Sola Street. So one of the slides, before we get to Gutierrez Street, I want to show you an historical black and white slide, photograph of State Street before it was State Street as we know it today. It was a muddy mess. But we've had a long tradition of using State Street to celebrate our culture, to celebrate our history. In 1886, we celebrated the Mission Centennial, and the entirety of State Street was used as a parade, regardless of the mud. And they had decorative arches, full-scale arches with twin towers depicting the mission that bridged over the top of State Street at several blocks. So we have this grand idea. So this slide portrays that idea of the arches that have been introduced over the history of State Street for parades and the Great White Fleet that visited from Teddy Roosevelt, etc. So there are a few folks that said we should repeat that arch idea, probably a little bit different than other cities, particularly in California. I can think of Bakersfield and Castroville that have the names implanted on an arch over the city. At one point in our history, north of us, Santa Maria had such an arch. It's now gone. But the idea was to present that. And then this slide shows this idea of a trolley. And I'll get to the trolley a little later, but maybe we should go to the next slide. So a lot of what we talk about on State Street is not only the street, but how it engages the blocks to each side. And one of the things that my colleagues really dove into was this idea of improving and introducing new openings to what we call paseos in Santa Barbara. And of course we have one famous one, El Paseo, which is introduced before actually the 1925 earthquake, which most people associate with the Spanish colonial architecture. Actually started before the earthquake, and that paseo has one of our most complete experiences as one ventures through the city. So in addition to the things I'm going to concentrate on, which is State Street itself, there are other ideas floating around about how to improve our paseo system in the same blocks from Gutierrez up to Sola Street. So this is one of 9 sections of State Street depicted essentially by blocks, starting at the 400 block, which is bounded by Gutierrez and Haley Street. Currently, the city is completing a really whimsical and extravagant underpass adaptation as State Street dives under Highway 101 from its beginning at Stearns Wharf and the Dolphin Fountain. And it now will be completed here in the next year. And then one crosses Gutierrez Street, and the previous slide showed the arch. It also showed the idea of a turntable for a trolley. But I'm going to come back to that, as I said earlier. But the other thing that happens on this block, there's a necessity by emergency vehicles, both for police and fire, to be able to have two-way vehicle traffic on this block because of the one-way couplets that Gutierrez and Haley Street are adapted to. But the other activity here is to try to increase the sidewalk space to allow for additional retail, particularly dining on this block, to expand into the street. The experience that we all dealt with the 100-year event of the COVID flu activity. And so this is a demonstration of how we might use it. On the left-hand side of this particular drawing, towards Haley Street on the bottom left, is the idea of a raised platform that could be handicap accessible, only about 18 inches off the ground, but it does present an example of how one might separate vehicle traffic and bicycle traffic from outdoor dining, utilizing the shade side of State Street, umbrellas, etc., without a full-on structure. This block also includes two-way bicycle traffic, indicated by the green starting points on each side of the traffic way. And then this includes the tracks for a two-way trolley. So that's the beginning of how to address some of the concerns people have expressed about not really giving enough room for the retail, particularly the dining facilities for restaurants, etc., on each side of this particular block of State, and how to enhance it and really introduce it as the beginning of this idea of a State Street, some have referred to as a promenade. It also includes the language of the tree forest that will become part of any future State Street plan. It's a transition from the palm-lined street that we're used to from down at the wharf and down at Cabrillo Boulevard as it start marching up State Street. It's a transition block which will lead to a different kind of urban forest as we pass Haley.
Fred, before you finish, there were a couple things. You mentioned an 18-inch height, and I just want you to reiterate, is that for the restaurant,
Right.
the seating?
Yes.
Talked about that.
Okay.
You're good.
Oh, okay. So, and just to reiterate, the raised platform area, the 18-inch platform, it's really for dining. We all experienced that in other cities around the world. Recently in a trip to Portugal, and prior to that, a trip to Copenhagen and to Oslo, Norway. I experienced those kinds of settings where there's this notion of visual safety between moving traffic, vehicles, buses, trolleys, and bicycles. So it's a way to do that with the dimensions at this part of State Street. We can accomplish that, still make it handicap accessible. There's a couple of ramps, and also for service from the indoor side of any restaurant that might join one of these examples.
Thank you.
So this is the next block as we move up State Street. Again, recall that State Street goes up the hill. So this is from Haley to Coda, and unlike the previous block where it was from Gutierrez to Haley, which in many views is a curbed street because it has vehicle traffic and requirements for California Vehicle Code, etc., probably does in fact require a curb. This is a street where we might be able to dismiss a curb and refer to it as what the State Street Advisory Committee has referred to as flat and flexible. So that's why there's two colors here. There's a color for the middle of the street, the 20-foot requirement for emergency vehicles, delivery access, etc., during the course of any activity day of this particular block. And then the lighter color indicates a paving surface that's amenable to outdoor dining. The colored areas of red and blue and gold are signifying umbrellas on the sun side of State Street, and the shadow on the western, or what I would refer to, because of the nature of how Santa Barbara is oriented at 45 degrees to the normal north-south grid, what I refer to the freeway side or the 101 side of State Street. And because of the nature of how the sun moves across Santa Barbara during most of the year, and particularly the hot areas of August and September and October, it casts a long, deep shadow for a good portion of the day from that side of the State Street. And when I was a young boy and had a privileged trip to come to Santa Barbara, I remember walking the shade side with my mother and grandmother and aunts that were down shopping for the day, and all the best women's dress shops and shoe shops were always on the shade side. And so I remember that, and that's a virtue that we all embrace. And so this drawing is reflective of that action. Also, the idea that overhead lighting could be an enhancement to what the State Street Committee has referred to as one of the three districts. This is an entertainment district because currently the 500 block of State Street is occupied by a majority of drinking establishment, restaurant establishment. There's now even a boutique hotel on one side, and then there's the Hotel Santa Barbara, which is part of our historical hotels within the State Street corridor. So that is a very important component, and also paseos to existing parking lots. And you'll see in the center of this drawing is a horizontal ceramic iconic idea for a denotation of something important happening in that juncture, which is the introduction of a major paseo to parking lot number 11, which is behind those establishments on State Street. That could be anything. There's also the opportunity to do vertical artistic elements or other denotations of a paseo that's about to happen. This particular design comes from the Islamic heritage from the southern part of Spain, the Andalusia, where most of our architecture has come from, which is heavily influenced by the occupation during that period of world history that allowed the interpretation into geometric forms. So, but it allows sufficient numbers to duplicate what we all experienced during the COVID pandemic phase of our life, where restaurants had to have outside dining facilities, what was referred to at that time as parklets. This really dispenses with the notion of a parklet, but it does allow outside dining in a wide swath of the 80-foot dimension from face to face to each side of the street where the buildings line up along State Street. And that leaves sufficient room on each side of 30 feet, more or less, dimension for retail shopping and strolling down what I refer to as the Fiesta de Ciudad, which is the party street of Santa Barbara, or of the city. So this portion of the plan is what we call the 600 block, which is still part of the Fiesta de Ciudad, because it does contain a movie theater, which we hope will continue, depending on how the movie world goes. It has lots of small retail stores. It has an historical building on the freeway side of State Street, the shade side, the 50th building, which preserves. There's some ideas of introducing a new paseo on that side of State Street that would saunter back to a paseo that's actually in development at the back of something called the Pierce Furniture Building, because it reflects originally that portion of State Street was a lumberyard, but now contains long, narrow retail spaces, and I'll share with you some observations about that in a moment. The other thing that's indicative of all these spaces, particularly on the blocks like this one that would also be curbless, is the use of bollards to pop up and down, electronically controlled, both by the use of any kind of vehicle trolley, but also by emergency vehicles, deliveries, so forth and so on, so they can move up and down, but it prohibits normal vehicle traffic from attempting to go down or up this street. This drawing also reflects the notion that we currently have a Tuesday, and have for a long period of time, a Tuesday farmers market. And so these little rooftop elements actually reflect the use of 10-foot by 20-foot tents, more or less what they use today, but a little more colorful. There's some discussion of maybe being able to replicate some things we see in Europe, where they're actually able to pop into a connection already in a finished street that provides electricity and water, etc. But it does require some thinking about how they're stored, brought out each week, how they're erected. So there's some thoughts about how to do that. There's issues about where the vendors park their trucks, etc. Currently, they park them right next to their pop-up tents. But those are discussions we need to have. And also then on the shade side, you'll see dining tables for restaurants. On the sun side of the State Street, particularly in the afternoon, there's dining tables with umbrellas, and then also this horizontal element of a small decal of some nature. This one I drew as flowers done in ceramic tile. They could be any number of things, including ideas about remembering the Chumash who walked on this land way before most of us came here. And also the passage to garage number 10 behind the Metro Theaters and Hamburger Habit. Those are all things we know, etc. So this is an idea about how do we accommodate things like a farmer's market.
And Fred, I see it's identified with limited vehicle traffic. Is that something whereby maybe during certain hours of the morning when it's not a high pedestrian time that the bollards could be down and trucks could come in and go to deliver to stores and things like that?
So the next slide depicts what we call the 700 and 800 block, and this is really, for most of us, the center of our civic life in Santa Barbara, our center of the city, for a whole lot of reasons. One is in the 1980s we introduced the Paseo Nuevo, the new Paseo versus the El Paseo, which is across the street at the top of this particular slide. Again, the shadow side is towards the freeway. The streets of De La Guerra, on both sides of the street, are actually still controlled by the city of Santa Barbara, which owns the land rights for much of Paseo Nuevo. But they control that. So this is the idea of reintroducing the covered little carts that used to be there for a period of time when Paseo Nuevo first opened, bringing those back so that can be used by entrepreneurs who want to start a small business and without a lot of rentable square footage. The eastern side, or the mountain side of State Street, or sun side of State Street, is De La Guerra Street. Under the current process, the city is pursuing the closure of De La Guerra Plaza to automobile traffic and a completely new approach to De La Guerra Plaza as our civic center. And as a part of that activity, they do propose closing De La Guerra Street on that side. I'm just adding the idea of putting a little information kiosk, which I'll show you later in elevation, introducing the palm tree activity, part of our history, Palm trees are not native to California. They were introduced as much of our trees were introduced. As you recall, particularly for those that read 2 Years Before the Mass by Richard Henry Dana, he talks about Santa Barbara being a plain of grass, trees that hugged the water source, which were basically sycamore and oaks, and that was pretty much it. So all the other trees that came, and we're a tree city in the United States, all the other trees were imported because of our climate. They grow well. There's a huge historic designated olive tree, pepper tree in front of the Santa Barbara City Hall, which comes from Chile. And they were brought here and planted, and that one is designated. There's also something called Stork placita, named after the Santa Barbara News Press Pulitzer Prize winner, stork. And it leads the way to the building now referred as the Santa Barbara News Press building. This is also an extension of the Tuesday Farmers Market. Right now it covers about 3 blocks on State Street. I think with a little effort we can make it cover 2 blocks. If necessary, we can figure out how it might go another block. This also has the vehicle area that's controlled by the bollards that move up and down as necessary, particularly when vehicles are allowed through this area. But again, a block of no curbs, curbless. One of the challenges of dealing with this block is that because of the activities, particularly the center where we show a little fountain and a semicircular plaza right off of De La Guerra Street, that there are those that think we ought to control the use of bicycles on this block. So this is drawn with the idea that bicycles can come through here certain hours of the day, but for some hours of the day they're going to have to get up and walk their bikes. But the other part of this is trying to give an idea of giving pedestrian warning to pedestrians that are crossing State Street that there is vehicle or trolley traffic or bike traffic, whatever. So a change in texture, a change in color, that's shown to you as a kind of a gold stripe on each side of the darker paved area, which is the emergency 20-foot vehicle area. Also, there's an example of how one might remember and celebrate the Chumash, as I talked about earlier. This is, on that little drawing, shows Chumash artwork on a horizontal plane in the walking area, very similar to what was done many years ago at the City Public Works building that's on Garden Street. If you go down there, you'll see, and it actually goes into the building, Chumash. It was actually presented and approved by a Chumash artist that did that many years ago. That's not to say it could also be vertical elements such as the Chumash bear, which was just recently introduced at the cemetery to commemorate the Chumash that were buried up by the Santa Barbara Mission, somewhere in the mission, etc. And there's a whole story behind that would take another hour to explain, but that's the idea. It also includes this notion of creating an urban forest, the beginning of an urban forest, so that we do take into account climate change and those issues that we want to address as citizens. It also has these horizontal ideas and introduce the existing paseos that go into Paseo Nuevo, and the existing paseo goes into our famous El Paseo that goes back to the De La Guerra adobe. We also know that ideas are now underway to how to introduce housing in downtown Santa Barbara in large numbers. So you'll see the identified of the site of the old Macy's department store. That may in fact turn into housing at some point in the future. There may be other things that will happen in the actual El Paseo. But this is a notion to try to identify all the things that have been discussed and talked about
over the last several years of what will happen in what I refer to as the De La Guerra de Ciudad. In other words, the Civic Center of Santa Barbara. So this area of State Street is kind of that transition that we will experience as we go through and continue to travel uphill. This is the block of Cannon Perdido Street up to Carrillo Street, which is essentially the main two cross streets of downtown Santa Barbara. It's interesting because there's introduction of new activities. Of course, we have national retailers, H&M store, there's others that are at that edge. There's also, I think, just most recently an approved boutique hotel at the other corner across from Marshall's. There's the Fiesta 5 theaters that are underneath the parking garage that's accessed from Anacapa. There's a notion of introducing a future paseo next to where today is the Apple store. The idea there, if we could focus on the little cross street crossing area that's depicted by the two colors, that's actually an exaggerated speed bump. Essentially, it provides us for a level access across the street, regardless of whether the street has curbs or no curbs. In this particular drawing, it does have curbs, because in one notion, there's some folks that feel we ought to have two-way normal vehicle traffic on this street so that you can loop around the various parking structures, both down Cannon Perdido on the freeway side and on the mountain side of State Street. That's not to say the street could be restricted to vehicle traffic in the future, as referred to by the State Street Committee as flat and flexible, but this shows you what happens when you introduce bike lanes on the top and the bottom of that wide paved area that's depicted in gray, like we would see on an asphalt street. Also, the idea of a two-way trolley, but going down to one lane, one trolley lane, as it moves through the De La Guerra Ciudad area of State Street because of the number of activities that may occur there. You'll also see in all of these slides I'm depicting ideas for vertical elements such as flagpoles. We have a grand tradition introduced to us by Mr. Mills many years ago that started our flag tradition of flying flags all year long, representing nonprofits, representing holidays, representing important issues that reflect of us as a community. So those are there. They're separated at about 40 feet between them. And that's important because if we reintroduce parades back onto State Street, my good friend Pete Georgi, who for many, many years started the Fiesta Parade at the Carriage Museum, shared with me that 35 to 40 feet is what you need to carry the carts and the floats and particularly the equestrians up State Street to get it through efficiently in the 2-hour window or hour window that the parade lasts. In the upper right of this particular slide, you'll see a white square. That's identifying one of 3 pavilions that I've shown on these drawings. These are small pavilions that would provide for outdoor dining, for dispensing of sandwiches, ice cream, information, coffee, whatever. These aren't walk-in restaurants at all. They're just large enough to accommodate a vendor who would lease them from the city, and then the city would provide hopefully outdoor dining tables each side with umbrellas or not umbrellas, depending whether they're on the shade side of State Street or the sun side of State Street, etc. So there's a lot of ideas on these drawings, and slowly each slide will try to pick up on ideas that aren't particularly suggested of this particular block. They can be used on any of the blocks that are portrayed as we talk about what do we want on State Street. So this depicts the 900,000 block of State Street from Carrillo up the hill, so to speak, you'll see the major intersection of Carrillo and State. The reason this is important, Carrillo and State actually have the same dimension between the buildings, 80 feet. Carrillo has 80 feet, State Street has 80 feet, unlike the other cross streets which are set at 60 feet by the Haley survey that was done in the 1800s. The idea is because the north-south grid, for purposes that Santa Barbara was set up as originally as a Midwestern square block city, it was actually turned 45 degrees to the north-south. So here is an idea of implanting a compass rose for those directions in the center of this intersection. And then the ability, perhaps at some point, like many other cities have endorsed, is a four-way all-stop for pedestrians so they can utilize crossing the whole intersection, both through the center and the side. Those, of course, are discussions for transportation and folks that monitor this kind of situation, and do we have enough folks to make it happen? Is it too dangerous, et cetera, et cetera. But it does allow for the right and left-hand turn lanes onto State. Again, this is a block where we're using an example of how you would do a curb street with the gray paving area for two-way traffic, bike lanes, and a trolley, either railed or non-railed. And then also continuing to try to get dimension in there, and can be done in 80 feet for outdoor dining. And then, of course, this notion of being able to bring an aisle back that's wide enough to bring parades back to State Street. It then starts up and bends a little bit now as we go from Figueroa up State Street. This is where La Arcada Court exists. And this is the idea that we maybe shift the available area for activities and events to what I call the museum side of State Street, and also the dining side of State Street, and moves it the roadway, the 20-foot right of way, to the shade side. So this is a continuation of what I call the Belle de Artes of the city. This is the arts district, as some have referred to it. This is certainly where our museum is. Our major art museum is located on the sun side of, or the mountain side of State Street. The San Marcos building, a very important component of our early pieces of architecture that were rebuilt and reconstructed after the 1925 earthquake. They contain paseos to grand interior courtyards that are always wonderful to explore. But this is moving the driving side of State Street for trolleys and perhaps two-way vehicles when necessary, but also perhaps a street block that limits the amount of bicycling at certain hours of the day. The ballards can move up and down. This may be a block where we require at certain areas that folks have to get off their bicycles and walk them through this block. But it does give us an increasing area of almost 40 feet on the museum side, so that we can introduce areas for major museum events, which is an integral part of our cultural aspect of our arts in the city. Provide space for either temporary locations for three-dimensional artwork, statues, and other objects, or permanent locations. It provides us a large area to utilize the monumental steps that descend from the museum level, which is kind of a nice idea that in the future they can be used as temporary seating for maybe an event that's on a little platform that could be placed in the event plaza for music or acting or other kinds of activities. And then the other idea is to take Anapamu Street and limit the parking, at least between Anacapa and Chapala, but continue to introduce vehicle traffic going both ways on that street, because it turns out that the Metropolitan Transit District does in fact need that traffic route to continue their service to the city for buses that need to find their way over to the Chapala Street Transportation Center. So you move that to one side of the street. That gives us dimension, remember, within the 60-foot width of Anapamu, to place a pavilion for food and beverage, for outdoor dining under umbrellas. It's an introduction to what will soon be our new library plaza, which will face Anapamu and increases the ability to have more activity. This is also an area where we retain the wonderful oak trees that are in front of the museum, the other trees that are there, and then begins to introduce additional shade cover with the new forest canopy, and then introduces this idea that was just put into place in this last year of reintroducing vehicle traffic, at least in one direction, going up State Street from Anapamu, so that buses that come from various retirement homes within the city and other activities can utilize a drop-off, a formal drop-off area that meets handicap accessibility in front of our renowned Granada Theater, which my firm actually worked on many years ago. My late partner, Roger Phillips, who did a wonderful job of reintroducing the Grand Theater Performing Arts Center in Santa Barbara, along with this notion of still providing for outdoor dining and retail space along State Street. One of the notions that one looks at when you look at people that have done this kind of research and et cetera over the years is that a good retail street has window shopping every 25 to 35 feet. And so this notion that yes, even in the day of Amazon and over the computer ordering, there's still a need for brick and mortar, as we're beginning to understand. Maybe not in the way we knew it when Ott's was our famous department store, but perhaps reintroducing more what we refer to as mom and pop, locally owned stores with unique retail items that we do need, in fact, to pay attention to how one travels up and down State Street to enjoy retail shopping. And that's going to get sorted out as we go through this master planning process. So this is the last of the blocks in the initial idea of what would State Street look like from Gutierrez to Solis. This gives us to Victoria Street and Sola. This is still part of our Bella de Artes de Ciudad, the art center of our city. This is where our famous Arlington Theater is located. We have a lot of our arts and cultural center is here. We have a lot of restaurants. We have a lot of outdoor dining in that grand Santa Barbara tradition. So how do you increase the space here, but also allow for vehicle traffic to go on Victoria Street where it's needed to circulate back and forth, to the parking lots and parking structures, Sola Street, where the main east-west or oceanside to mountainside the bicycle routes are in the city, and also then how do we deal with getting back on one's bicycle, getting back up State Street, and then transitioning into the existing bike lanes that are above Sola Street as it heads upstate towards Mission. So there's identifying ways to do that. I'm not a traffic engineer, never claimed to be one, but certainly try to give it a shot in this sketch. And then this sketch demonstrates this notion about a rail trolley. One could say in this day and age of technology, we certainly don't need to have a rail trolley. It could be a trolley on wheels, it could be a trolley in any other fashion, it could be called something entirely different. But the idea is you have an experience of a transportation type that moves you up and down State Street, perhaps from Sola all the way to the wharf, where the trolley would turn around the Dolphin fountain and come back up the street. There would be maybe perhaps several trolley cars at any one time. That all can be electronically transmitted and controlled, directed with bollards that need to go up and down as you move up and down State Street. It's certainly not a notion perhaps of accommodating all the traffic that perhaps an organization like the MTD would look at, but it's introducing that experience. Certainly many of us have experienced that in a place like San Francisco, where at the bottom of the street that goes up to Nob Hill, where we as children remember standing in line, waiting to get on the trolley, and actually even helping push the trolley around on the trolley turntable. That's the idea. You'll see a trolley turntable shown on this sketch right behind another arch that introduces this section of State Street, maybe similar to the one at Gutierrez. These are the kinds of things that future designers and architects will address as one moves along. We just need to decide, is that a component that we would like on State Street or not like? Those are decisions that will be made as the community goes through this dialogue of discussion, as we talk about the kinds of things, the kind of dreams that we want to think about on State Street. Certainly the Paseos. My memory, the very first architect I met in my entire life when I was 13 and my father brought me to Santa Barbara, was on that Paseo in the Arlington Theater, where they had an office in those days. I knocked on the window and I shook his hand, and I'll remember it my entire life. So this is a slide that depicts the cable railway, a trolley. And it turns out that at the beginning of this discussion, I showed a photograph of an early trolley drawn by horses in Santa Barbara on State Street down at Stearns Wharf in 1880. But it turns out in San Diego they had hundreds of these at that same period of time. And they were rather small, and I felt it was important to look at the scale and style of a trolley, be it railed or not railed, that would move up and down State Street. So given the wonder of Google Earth and everything else that we have available to us today, I was able to dig up the dimensions of what a new trolley might look, or what a small trolley might look like. So this is the notion of a small scale trolley, maybe seats 12 people, 16 people, certainly not horse-drawn, although that could be a good idea. That presents a whole other set of problems. But the notion that the scale is appropriate to the city street. Now, some may refer to this as the Disneyland effect. Well, so be it. We are famous for our architecture. We're famous for making decision in the 1920s and the 1900s. It actually started in 1912 of adopting to architecture from the south of Spain, Andalusia, where many of the early architects that established their practices here in Santa Barbara had taken the grand tour as one would take if you were a wealthy young architect, which most of them were at that period in the history of the United States. And they came back with all these ideas. And our community embraced that and introduced that. And so yes, in some ways, as a young architect, when I came to Santa Barbara, this notion of coming down to a Spanish Andalusian city and wanting to do contemporary modern architecture just was not maybe in the same realm. But I've chosen over the years that my wife and our family chose to live here. We know it's a privilege to live in Santa Barbara, maybe not a right, but a privilege. And as such, we began over the years to embrace that notion that we should hold on to that wonderful heritage that is making our city worldwide renowned for who we are. So let's take that notion of a Santa Barbara trolley, maybe in Santa Barbara colors. I'm not sure this might be the colors we adapt, but certainly not San Francisco's red cable cars. We can certainly, under all the ability we have today in technology to make them handicap accessible. We can make them visually accessible. Remember, handicap is not just folks that are confined to a wheelchair, but they're confined to folks all the way from a Helen Keller type condition to someone that's on a temporary crutch because they broke their leg or they had an accident and they still want to get up and down State Street. And also for the mom and dad who've got 4 kids and they started to cross off from Stearns Wharf, and they're going to walk up State Street, and by the time they get to Ortega, it's hot, it's uncomfortable. Mom and dad, can't we go home now? Etc. It's always nice to have the alternative to be able to jump on a trolley or some other activity that gets them further up to State Street. And for all of us that have lived here for a long time, we have this notion that we can see the ocean from the top of State Street, from the Arlington block, or we can see the Arlington Theater Tower from Gutierrez. If you really go out there and look today, you can't do that. It's covered with trees, there are other obstacles. There's not a real way to bring back that mindset that we had when we were young and State Street was wide open at 80 feet with 4 lanes of traffic, and yes, you could see all the way to Stearns Wharf. That doesn't happen today. So I would encourage all of us to go back out and re-walk State Street and really look at what you can see. So we also had, as I mentioned earlier, this notion of introducing a new De La Guerra design plaza to Santa Barbara as it connects to State Street, again in what I call the De La Guerra de Ciudad. This is an idea that I came up with one weekend after following the team that's currently working on the design, and making it much simpler, introducing some elements people have talked about, grass and lawn and bubbling fountains, but also the notion of Chumash culture and history. This one depicts a ceramic tiled horizontal element in the plaza that shows the Channel Islands, where the lost woman was, etc. Shade trees and flags, and also a small stage and perhaps a small building that accommodates restrooms rather than placing it in Store Placita, which may be a hindrance to really opening De La Guerra to State Street. And then, of course, we talked about earlier the idea of opening De La Guerra Street back to State. So this is a slide that represents big dreams. This is really, really a challenge. Will it ever happen in my lifetime? Will it happen in my children's lifetime or my grandchildren's lifetime? Who knows? But when you do a master plan, I always like to encourage people to put on paper, it's just a piece of paper with a sketch on it, but to introduce this idea of a big dream. And some of us have thought about opening up De La Guerra Plaza and really marrying it to State Street. It's our living room, making State Street part of our living room, and that's De La Guerra Plaza. It's different than the wonderful sunken gardens of the courthouse, where we have many events through the course of the year, including Fiesta, including Easter, all the other events that we have. I'm old enough to remember when Queen Elizabeth visited Santa Barbara, and on a very rainy day, we all crowded in around the sunken gardens of the courthouse to see her visit, etc. But this is a different sort of space. This is the active space where we come to protest, where we come to make our feelings known about politics, about culture, about other activities, and then just simply through the course of any day, we come to sit under the trees, under the shade, have lunch, maybe listen to a small quartet, etc. But this notion, this dream is, okay, let's address some things here. Let's perhaps revisit Store Placita. Let's revisit the single-story restaurants, buildings that line between the historic Placita building and where today's Blenders is. That building, or at least the adjacent buildings, is now being proposed for another hotel that's on the docket. But this then takes 80 feet wide and opens it directly to State Street. And again, this notion of a water fountain, a water element, plenty of room for outdoor dining, trees to add to our urban forest. And it takes the square footage in those one-story buildings and divides it into two new buildings on each side of that 80-foot opening that could accommodate on its lower level retail and restaurant space, and on the upper level could be offices or housing or anything we choose. But this is a big idea. Is it a real challenge? Certainly. There's those in the historic community that consider the one-story restaurant buildings that we see today as a historical significant period of our city. Certainly the bricks that made those buildings came from, as I understand it, the debris of the 1925 earthquake. But perhaps they're not as historical, certainly, as the La Cita building, which houses on the top floors our city attorney's offices. So this is an idea. This is a big idea. Will it ever happen? Who knows? These are kind of things that present pushback, and Santa Barbara has a grand history of taking a long time to make decisions. It took us 30 years to eliminate the stoplights at Highway 101 and make a decision about whether or not we were going to have State Street go over the top of a freeway, under a freeway, at the level of the freeway, etc. But doing a master plan is this idea of dreaming big. And here also is this other idea of a little pavilion that's down at the corner, at the bottom of the slide, at the current entry to Paseo Nuevo, etc. But again, this is just an idea. It's a sketch on paper, the value of which is the cost of the paper. So this is an elevation study of that plan that I just discussed about opening 80 feet to De La Guerra Plaza. That's depicted in the center of these elevations with two new buildings to each side, the umbrellas and the flags and trees looking to the mountains. One of the unique features about Santa Barbara that sometimes we forget is the view to those mountains. They define more than anything Santa Barbara. That's why we're called the Riviera of America. It's because if you look at, there's a famous painting by Claude Monet in our Santa Barbara Art Museum, and I always refer to it as the Santa Barbara painting. It's a painting Monet did in Italy, where he's looking up from a small town in Italy, it's now a very large town, looking up to the mountains with mansions to either side of the street, and they're looking up to those mountains. And my wife, who used to teach for many years in our local schools, would bring her first and third graders or whatever to the museum, and they'd stand there and they'd look at that painting and say, well, that's Santa Barbara. So that's the notion of making sure whatever we do along State Street, including the notion of an urban forest, that we allow at certain points for being able to view up to those mountains. To be able to engage in that in a very real way. It makes us unique from other California coastal cities. The thing that might come closest is Santa Cruz, but its mountains are further away from its downtown core. Certainly places like Ventura have a little bit of a mountain view, but they don't have that spectacular sandstone, La Cumbre Peak, and others notions as we move towards Montecito, and certainly out towards Goleta and the Gaviota Coast. So that's the idea of showing how opening up to De La Guerra Plaza might encourage us to really engage our living room with our main retail street. So here's an early photograph, another photograph of the use of State Street for parades. This is this notion of these arcades that were built temporarily. They were decorated in flowers and vines and ivy and palm fronds, etc. And we've done it for years. And of course, I always get asked as an architect, well, gee, Fred, you've drawn all this stuff. It's all your idea. Well, no, it's not all my idea. As I said earlier, I'm translating the ideas that I've heard for the last 4 or 5 years about what we should do at State Street. But I would be foolish to say that I don't have certain passions. And my 2 passions in doing these sketches and drawings is bringing back the grand tradition of parades on State Street, unlike in many other cities in California. We predated the Pasadena Rose Parade, etc. Dwight Murphy, who was very active in the beginnings of Fiesta and the Fiesta Parade, chose to reintroduce the Palomino as a sporting horse equestrian on his ranch that ultimately led to Cachuma Lake and the water we now get from there. That he wanted to introduce, and there's grand photographs of the Palominos marching up and down State Street over the years, and of course what became one of the country's largest equestrian parades, etc. But we also have our Solstice Parade, which perhaps may be even more famous than the Fiesta Parade. So let's bring those back. And also for those of us as parents that recall our children marching up State Street or marching down State at the Christmas parade, the veterans at 4th of July being able to come up and down State Street, honoring those who served this nation, that served us as Santa Barbarans. This is very important to me as my adopted city, my adopted home, and also the notion of the trolley. I think that's really, really important in experience. The trolley is the worst case, so to speak, when you're doing a plan, because it would require rails in the street, and you got to think about all those things. But we know how to deal with that. Certainly Disney does it all over the world. They have trolleys railed or not in all of their venues across the world. They know how to do it. We know how to do it. So issues of tripping and all those kind of things can be sorted out. So let's move on to some other images of what this all could look like. So this is, architects like to do sections because they really start to understand what the plan design looks like, what dictates how you do a perspective or a 3D visual. And so you start with sections. And so this is a parade section for Solstice. What does it take to get the big Solstice balloon up State Street between Coda and Sola? And certainly still allow dining on both sides and ability to have folks sit on the small grandstands, etc. The vertical elements that are important, the flagpoles, the street lights, the tree trunks, where do they need to be placed in order to give us the urban force we want, to give us the gaiety of having flags and the colorful activities of things like the Solstice Parade. So can't forget in doing these kind of sections, Fiesta Parade still requires those dimensions, the introduction of the flags and the banners that Paul Mills submitted into our history many years ago, the flags at the harbor, the flags on State Street. He's an individual like many other individuals that took their knowledge, their artistic bent, and contributed to who we are as Santa Barbarans and how important art is to our community, art is to the State Street experience, and all the other activities that occur year-round. So these are just a series of sketches of these ideas. This is the kiosk I talked about at De La Guerra Street. Colorful, open, ability to provide information to tourists and others wanting to know about our history, what's available, walking tours, activities of the week, etc. And also introducing overhead lighting, the palm trees, all part of our history. So this set of sketches is those little pavilions that are probably oriented towards more of a steel finish so that we have something durable. They're not an indoor dining experience at all. They're just a prep area for dispensing of coffee or pastries or sandwiches. visiting recently, my adult children live, one of my adult children and son-in-law live in Santa Cruz on Pacific Street, their version of State Street. They have some small versions just that look almost exactly like these. I know they exist in Santa Monica on 3rd Street Promenade, which has its own challenges. So this is just an idea. This is an opportunity for the city to introduce business folks that want to get into the entrepreneur mom and pop world of retail, both in the restaurant business and in the retail business. So this is the other end. Architects always like to draw front and back, but the importance of this slide is you have to accommodate the dimensions for State Street. You've got to make sure there's enough room for walking, being able to stand in line. These units would be not more wider than 8 or 10 feet because you also have to accommodate the tree canopy, etc. So this little sketch depicts a couple important things. One is this notion of water. Now, we have all experienced lengthy drought periods where we shut off our fountains, we shut off the water, we did all kinds of things to reduce our usage. We got rid of our lawns, we introduced drought-tolerant landscaping, native landscaping, and all of those things are important and still should be done. But the other thing that we took from Andalusia, where, as I mentioned before, most of our architecture comes from, is their celebration of engineering of water. When you go to cities as Granada or you go to the Alhambra, you see that they have celebrated how they brought water from the nearby snow-capped mountains around Granada to the city, put them in irrigation ditches, put them into little fountains, put them into little traveling. If you've been to the In El Jalife, across the mountain across from the Alhambra, you'll see how they did it. So this notion that, yes, on occasion we should celebrate water. There's nothing wrong, in my view, of having a fountain. Today we recycle that water. We don't bring it in constantly. There's ways to do this to celebrate the folks that brought us the water from Lake Cachuma across the mountains through the Tecolote Tunnel, for the folks that made sure we still have water coming to Santa Barbara, that we also have the water in the ocean that we rely on for our tourist industry, our fishing industry, etc. And also because of that ocean, not only are we known because of our architecture and many other things, we're also known for our disasters. This city came together in the 1960s after the massive oil spill that occurred. Because of those things, it brought our city together to think hard and long about how we deal with things like that. And today, of course, we're confronted with climate change. The other notion on this little slide is the introduction of the aroma of Santa Barbara. The idea that we introduce the citrus. Citrus was always a big, important part of our being. Certainly Carpinteria and Goleta celebrated in a very distinctive way, but the citrus aroma of State Street, the aroma of roses, the aroma of flowers has always been very important. We have a wonderful rose garden up at the Mission State Historical Park that's part of our being that we celebrate here in our city. So this is a quick sketch of an idea of providing visual cues to individuals that are going to use State Street, particularly the bicycle riding community. Certainly the bollards will pop up and down for all practical reasons. You need to have the opening for emergent vehicles. But the introduction of vertical planters, it alerts an individual that something's about to change as you come up from State Street. Now that's not to say that there's going to be signs put here and there that indicate what you have to do on this block, either get off and walk your bike or slow your bike down or whatever, etc. But just as we use roundabouts and other things with vehicle traffic, we can start to learn and introduce the culture of bike riding to visual cues that certainly one sees When we go to Europe, where they do have a culture that goes way back to bicycle riding, children are taught from a very early age how to behave on riding a bike, and that transfers into adulthood. We may not have that so much, but we're getting there. So introducing these kind of visual cues, I think, will be important as we discuss it. Now, does it need to look exactly like this? Certainly not. There's much more talented design architects and designers than perhaps I am, and we'll think about other ways to do this. So here's a notion of perhaps currently we've just approved and are celebrating the fact that we're bringing the Saturday farmers market to State and Carrillo Street. And we're hoping that that will really continue that long participation and dedication to our farmers, our community that enjoys shopping weekly for fresh produce and fruits and vegetables and so forth. But this was a notion of what would it take, maybe if we need to put it in a different location. This happens to be at State and Ortega as an alternative location for a farmer's market. It still allows for the ballards to go up and down. It allows for a trolley track to go through as necessary. It allows for the canopies and the tents that one needs to display their merchandise at a farmer's market, etc. So again, just an idea, just a sketch, some things to think about. So again, a little sketch of the flag poles and the palm trees and the kiosk at De La Guerra Plaza. You see City Hall in the background and the opening around the corner to De La Guerra Plaza, the Bothine building on the right-hand side, and what I refer to as the Weston building on the left-hand side, and then a plaza, different paving materials in the center of State Street. And what happens when you introduce the traffic lanes depicted in the gray color for asphalt, and the ballards and the planters. There's also this notion that planters can be movable. They can be up on wheels. I've seen them in other cities, both here in this country. There's some in Canada, and I've seen them in Oxford just recently in Britain. And then again, the trolley moving up and down, and from an electronic standpoint, those all can be handled on a telephone. You just click a button, the ballards go down, the trolley goes across, they come back up, and you can circumvent the other trolley coming the other way. And so the other activity depicted earlier in this discussion was what happens on Winnepemu Street, where we do need to continue to allow MTD to move their buses in the east-west direction across State Street. The outdoor pavilion by one side of the Santa Barbara Art Museum, which is depicted in the back of this sketch, and in the foreground, the bike riders, the pedestrians, sculpture in the event area that's in front of the main steps of the museum. Just to give you an idea in 3 dimensions of what this might look like. So this is an idea that might perplex a few folks. It's a big idea. It's what might happen on any of the blocks along State Street, particularly when we're talking about how do we continue to accommodate housing on State Street that will increase its vibrancy by introducing more foot traffic, more folks to downtown Santa Barbara. How do we do that? How do we deal with that? This is a sketch of the 600 block looking towards the Highway 101 side of State Street, the shade side. This is the Pierce block, or the Pierce building, with the Bothane building on the far right of this sketch. And this idea that particularly some of us are used to the fact that in this block, some of these retail stores that exist there today, or did exist, go back 150 feet, and they're only 20 or 25 feet wide, and they go very deep. Well, I learned something interesting as I started to do research and talk to others on State Street retail positions. Yes, in the early days, when this was translated from a lumber yard to a retail street, they built these stores with large, deep stores And they did it because, unlike today where we have inventory on demand, in those days a retailer would buy their inventory once a year, maybe twice a year, and they'd have to have a place to store it. So they made these long, deep stores. So yeah, the first 30 or 40 feet was the retail part of the store, but the back half was their storage for their inventory. Well, now, today, under the current retail model, you don't need that anymore. You have inventory on demand, and the brick and mortar, in some respects, may move to more of a sample store, where sometimes, like I do, I leave the store and then go online and order it. What happens if we want to rethink what happens at the back of these deep stores? And what that introduces is this notion of perhaps introducing multi-story housing to the backside, so that it doesn't necessarily destroy the storefronts we're used to that face right on State Street, right at the 80-foot mark of the right-of-way width of State Street, but allows multi-story housing, 3, maybe 4 stories high, deeper into the middle of the block between, say, in this case, State and Chapala Street. That's not to say it couldn't happen in the opposite direction. One thing I would caution is the height issue. And we all get quite concerned. In 1972, the community, thanks to nudging from Pearl Chase and Thomas Stork, we actually put into effect a charter amendment that limits our highest buildings to 60 feet throughout the city, irregardless of whether it's residential or commercial or institutional space. Most of our city in the residential area is limited to 30 feet. But we need to think about the view to those mountains. And as we think about putting buildings on the mountainside of State Street, we really need to think about how that's accommodated in what we always refer to as scale and bulk. Scale being the reference to the human person, bulk meaning how the building is laid out on a particular site. And so that's something to think about. The other little idea that popped in here next to the 50th building shown on the right of this sketch is an opening for a new paseo. And it can come in all forms and fashions. This is one I stole literally from a sketch I did while I was in Rome several years ago, where at one point in their history they used figures to outline a storefront or a door front, or in this case an opening to a paseo that would go in to the middle of the block. So again, these are just sketch ideas. They're not meant to coerce anyone to do anything. Certainly property owners will want to think long and deep about what kind of future commitments they make for their properties. But this is all part of this discussion that I believe one needs to have as we move as a community to precipitate deep discussion about not only the big general ideas, bikes, no bikes, traffic, no traffic, building, no building, height, no height, all the other kinds of things that ultimately will lead us in the long term to a master plan that depicts not only the practical side of things we need to think about, drainage and water and all those other kinds of things, but also the big visions, the big dreams. Where do we want our children, our grandchildren to experience on State Street some things that we may never see, particularly folks of my age group. So I hope that little journey through some ideas about State Street will help the dialogue to continue and hopefully move the decision-making process along so that we can in fact adopt a visual master plan for what the future of State Street and Santa Barbara looks like.
Okay, great. Well, Fred, thank you very much for first taking the time to synthesize this vision And I really want to emphasize that phrase. I know this is a challenging process, and Fred's emphasized that this is not like a finished rendering. This is about trying to listen as deeply as possible to so many different voices and coming up with something that's inspiring and actually brings the people who live in the city out to State Street to enjoy it, and also brings tourists into town so we can have a thriving economy from people coming from out of town. So I'm grateful for you for taking the time to render all this. And now the question is, do others in the community want to take this inspiration and get behind some kind of rendering that incorporates these inspirations, moves in this direction, moves beyond the discussion of do we have bikes or pedestrians or cars, and comes up with a colorful vision that that's cohesive. When I step back and I listen to the discussion about a trolley car, there's something about it that is so discreet for a section of State Street and is so romantic and taps into something where if I was a tourist thinking about where I would want to go, that kind of encompasses a destination that you can come here to this city, put the car keys down, not have to get in an Uber, not have to pay a bus to get on and off and figure all that stuff out. Just have a trolley car that moves up and down. For me, that just feels really filled with light and like it would really be attractive for people considering where they want to spend their tourist dollars. So, is there any finishing comments you'd like to add, Fred?
I think so. One of the notions when you're doing this kind of community activity is, and particularly in a place like Santa Barbara, where we're a tourist-oriented city, we all recognize that, is that it's important we also do something that really addresses we as citizens. Us taking our grandchildren down to ride on a trolley. Us wanting to go down for an evening to see art, or attend the Granada, or the Arlington, or anything else on State Street, the museum, the first Thursday art shows, etc. Those are the kind of things that if you do it well for those that live here, then it works well for those that visit. And I think those that have been able and had the privilege of being able to travel, particularly in Europe and South America and other locations, that's what you find out. Things started addressing the issues of the citizens who lived in the community. And we always forget that we're a relatively new country. A lot of the things that we look at in Europe have taken years, hundreds of years to develop. Things we always cherish when we talk about going to Italy or Florence, or we going to Barcelona, etc. It didn't happen because some architect, and architects love to do this, to sit down and design every damn thing, including the trash can.
Yeah.
And one of the problems we as artichokes have is we try to do too damn much. And at some point you got to just stop and step aside and let others take over, and let others contribute, let others foster the ideas. Part of the challenge, because we're a city full of architects, we have probably more architects than we have nonprofits in a city our size. So we always have to kind of hold our breath and say, okay, architects, you can talk, but we as citizens need to talk about what we need. And I think we sometimes forget that. Yes, we're a tourist city, but we have to concentrate on what's good for us as a community to survive and prosper and continue to be a part of who we are as Californians and members of this unique country we get to live in. So I hope sharing all of this will allow that dialogue to continue. And if I step back and don't participate any further, and that occurs, I will achieve what I think I set out to do.
Wonderful, wonderful. And thank you. So to that end, if you're interested in getting behind the intent behind this presentation, I'll step forward. You're welcome to contact me. We'll put up my contact information, and we can talk together about next steps.
Thanks, Eric. And Eric has volunteered to be the contact point, because I'm of the age that started computers when they had cards that you had to file at midnight to get to work. And I don't keep my calendar on my phone as many other people do. I still keep it on Sierra Club calendars. I have 40 years worth of handwritten notes. So thank you, Eric, for being the point person.
Glad to help out. All right. And a hearty thanks to Connor Clancy for stepping forward and doing a fantastic job recording this whole thing. Thanks. Take care.